Muhammad Ali was bigger than boxing and larger than life. He was a true icon of the 20th century who called himself the greatest and backed up his words inside and out of the ring. This Sunday, PBS airs part one of a sweeping new four-part documentary on the life and legacy of Muhammad Ali. Here's a short clip from the film of Ali's rematch with Joe Frazier in 1974.
In the ninth, his face swollen from Frazier's blows and his nose trickling blood, Ali connected with 10 punches for every one landed by Frazier, inspiring chants of Ali from the electrified crowd.
This is as good as the last fight. Plenty of excitement at old Madison Square Garden.
Epic battles. And joining us now with more are Donald LeCere of the Chicago History Museum, who for years was president and CEO of the Muhammad Ali Center in Louisville, Kentucky, and filmmaker Ken Burns, who co-directed with Sarah Burns and David McMahon. Welcome both of you back to Chicago tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Ken, as I understand, you started production on this film, you and your team, 5 years ago, or more than 5 years ago, when Ali died. Given all that's been written and documented about Ali, how challenging was it for you and your team to get to the essence of such a transformative figure?
Well, we began it 7 years ago, or even more when we decided to do it. Our job is not to sort of look over our shoulders at the previous work that's been done. We do acknowledge lots of great documentaries on Muhammad Ali. Most of them are about a specific fight or a couple of years. We were interested in the entire story, a kind of comprehensive biography from his birth and boyhood in Jim Crow segregated Louisville, Kentucky, to his death by Parkinson's just 5 years ago. And we would treat the boxing, which I've called the complete works of William Shakespeare. Those matches are so dramatic, including the one you just shared a clip from, but also the journey, the spiritual journey of a questing and serious man about what his place in the world and in the universe was, and continue to look at the personal life and really see that he is intersecting with all of the themes of the last half of the 20th century, the role of sports in society, the role of the black athlete, the definitions of black masculinity and black manhood, the changing dimensions and dynamics of the civil rights movement, race in general, faith, religion, Islam, war, politics, sex, all of those things intersect. And what comes out the other side is just a compelling, unbelievable figure in my mind.
And Donald, you were head of the Muhammad Ali Center, as we mentioned, for several years. He founded that in the early 2000s. Did Ali ever have any conversations with you about these big issues, about what he wanted his legacy to be?
Well, when I started at the Ali Center in 2012, Muhammad didn't speak much except with his eyes, but I had many conversations with Lonnie Ali, his wife, and his friends, Howard Bingham, and other folks. The best conversations I had about Muhammad Ali, believe it or not, were with people he fought, particularly Larry Holmes and George Foreman. And the love that they had for the man was amazing. What Ken talked about him basically not just being a sportsman, but being a spokesperson and a representative of Black people around the country. Larry Holmes and George Foreman appreciated the courage that it took for him to do that. And when you would sit down and talk with them, and especially Larry, who knew him when he was a very young man, and talked about just being around him and the fact that he had the ability to just generate so much energy in any room he went into. But more importantly, and Ken pointed this out in his film, and I think it was Rashida that said it, that when you were with him, you were with him, and he really focused on you.
Ken Burns, you mentioned he grows up in Louisville in the Jim Crow South, grows up as Cassius Clay, goes on to beat Sonny Liston in his early 20s, probably becomes heavyweight champion of the world, and then embraces the Nation of Islam. Remind us the perception that the Nation of Islam had in that day, and how Ali came to that, and how big a role it played in his life.
He had already been introduced to its teachings through a record that he had bought several years before that was actually read by the man that now goes as Louis Farrakhan. The Nation of Islam he had already fully embraced, but he could not dare speak it until he was the heavyweight champion. It had been labeled a hate group. It is a cult. It doesn't really resemble mainstream Islam in a way. A lot of its tenets are kind of a hybrid Americanized version, but it gave this young questing man, obviously struck by what's going on in the world and the changing dynamics of civil rights, his father's own frustrations with his own inability to advance as a painter. He's relegated to being a sign painter, to the murder and torture of Emmett Till in the open casket that he and every other black person in America saw in pictures in Jet magazine because his mother had the courage. And the Nation of Islam offered something that he could find. He'd also befriended one of their most articulate ministers, a person named Malcolm X. And Malcolm X became a friend and a mentor. And eventually, as you know, Malcolm X was expelled from the Nation of Islam in large measure because I think he was getting too powerful and too popular. And he was also very political, where the nation was trying to not be. It was trying to be separatist and develop businesses and community-based things. And then, of course, he was later murdered by members of the Nation of Islam. At that same time, Cassius Clay was then given the name Muhammad Ali, and you know, he's already a voluble and bragging athlete in a time when people don't think athletes should do that. Strike one, he joins the Nation of Islam and changes his name. Strike two, and then later on, he's going to refuse induction into the United States Army. Strike three, and so the reputation of the Nation of Islam as a hate group and all of that stuff sort of conspires. And we like to say, you know, he was loved at the end of his life, but he was so divisive. I don't think he was divisive. I think we were divisive. We're the ones who said to a black man who was following his faith, no, you're giving the middle finger to the United States government. This is a political gesture, when in fact it was not that. So it's a very complicated story, and Muhammad Ali is a very complicated person and has lots of faults.
And Muhammad Ali is also sort of part of that tug of war in the Nation of Islam between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, as you document in the film. It's very fascinating. You talk about that strike three, Donald Lassere. That affected his fight here in Chicago in 1966, where he appeared before the Illinois Athletic Commission. Remind us about that event and what happened.
Well, I'll let Ken talk to that because he did cover that in the documentary. But as you know, I mean, because of his association with the nation, Mayor Daley didn't let him fight here in Chicago, basically. And what was really interesting, and I want to make a comment to Ken's comment about the Nation of Islam. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. And one of the things that happened when you were on the south side of Chicago and there was someone from the nation around, you felt safe. And that's something that a lot of people lose sight of. I was very young at the time, and it was a dynamic that was very interesting, and I'm sure that was very appealing to a young Cassius Clay when he would see Black men dressed in suit and ties, clean, shaven, very well spoken for the most part, and very proud of who they were. And so I just want to speak to that as a Chicagoan, that when the nation surfaced here in Chicago, we didn't view them as radical. Most of us didn't anyway. They, again, made us feel safe as Black people in certain neighborhoods. And I'm sure that was appealing.
Donald Lassere, can I just ask you about our current day, when you see athletes like Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, when you see athletes protesting George Floyd, LeBron James speaking out. Is the climate different now when Black athletes speak out about social issues or oppression versus when Muhammad Ali did it? And is the reaction in the country different now?
Oh, it certainly is. So again, as Ken said, when Muhammad spoke out, you know, there were a lot of people who conflated his conscientious objection with him being anti-American. And that was not only just white people, that was universal throughout our culture. You know, there were a lot of Black people that disliked Muhammad because he made that statement. Now you fast forward to today, he's a great representation of what athletes should be doing with their platforms. You know, speaking out against injustice, which is what he was doing. Speaking, you know, out against, you know, the inequities that exist. And so I think athletes now, particularly Black athletes, based on what they saw from Muhammad Ali, some of them feel it's their duty now to use their platform.
So many fascinating parts of this documentary, and we haven't even talked about the actual fights and his fighting style itself, but you can go watch the documentary to find that because we're out of time here. Our thanks to Donald Lasseter and Ken Burns. Thank you as always for joining us. And part one of the documentary, Muhammad Ali, airs on WTTW this Sunday at 7. And Brandis Friedman will have more with Ken Burns and Donald Lasseter on Chicago Tonight, Black Voices, this Sunday night at 6. And we have much more about Ali's life and legacy on our website, WTTW.com/Ali.